I'd hoped to make a video demonstrating how I started and finished this assembler project, but I guess I don't have my act together. I can't find any of the original discs I used, and it would be pointless with me just standing here describing it. But I would like to demonstrate that my assembler is effectively finished. It can assemble itself. Now, also, unfortunately, here I can't really show the whole assembly program anymore. I've separated it into uh, about a dozen different files. But I will demonstrate how it works. And the point being, it can assemble itself. And since it can assemble itself, I no longer need the basic assembler, which I've already made obsolete, I guess. My assembler will no longer assemble in the basic assembler. I've added too much functionality. Now this is what I've made the slow version of the assembler. It essentially does exactly the same thing the basic assembler does. Basically just to demonstrate that it works the same and how much faster it is. Now the reason I always had to display all of this text when assembling in BASIC is because there was no decent way, once you get an error, to rescan the file and display the line that has the error. So the way I wrote the basic assembler is that it displays all the lines as it's assembling, and when it stops and there's an error, then you can see the code that it had been assembling recently, and you get an idea of where your error was. I no longer need to do that. I have a mechanism where if I have an error, I can quickly find it in the editor. But like I say, just to demonstrate how much faster this is than the basic version of the assembler, I have this slow version. And I guess if you really want to compare, you can find the video that I made of the entire assembly process in BASIC. Now, the current state of this assembler, if I could still assemble this in the basic assembler, it would take probably about 7 hours. When I had assembled it in BASIC for the last time, it was 4 hours 52 minutes. And I've added quite a bit of functionality since then. And I'm not sure how long this takes. Of course, I don't normally run this slow version of the assembler. I think the fast version, well, I know it takes less than 10 minutes. I'm not exactly sure how much less. I don't stand around and watch it. Now, of course, it would be much faster, except I'm using a Commodore 1541 disk drive, which is incredibly slow. You can see every time the code pauses scrolling here that the next section of code is being read from the disk. And had this been a parallel disk drive or a disk drive on most other systems, each one of these times when you see it load would take a fraction of a second, and of course you see here it takes several seconds. So I'm not sure how much time is spent reading and writing at the disk drive, but it's a significant portion of the time it takes to assemble a program. That doesn't really bother me. If it did, of course, I would come up with a better solution. I would probably at least get Jiffy DOS or one of those solutions, or build a parallel interface for the 1541, or maybe get a hold of an IEEE EEE 488 interface for the Commodore 64 and use a large CBM drive. Of course, I've got a CBM hard drive here I could use. But I've lived with this for 35 some years, probably more than that. I guess I don't have a problem with the speed. We'll see here how long this takes. Now what I had intended to do was make a video explaining the whole process of how I made this. It's quite a long process. And I did this out of necessity the first time in 1980 something. I could not afford to buy an assembler. Actually, I did buy an assembler, and the problem was I had bought GeoAssembler, and it requires GeoWrite. Now, at the time I bought that, most people had a version of GeoS that came with GeoWrite built in. My version of GeoS did not come with GeoWrite. It was a very early version. So I never did get to use that assembler, and I purchased it for nothing, I guess. So what I had to do was write my own assembler, and that was a very, very long process. Took years to do. Now the second time I did it in 2013 was not out of necessity. I could probably download an assembler somewhere for free. But I like my assembler, and my syntax is a little bit different than other assemblers because I wrote it not knowing how to use other assemblers. And because I can. I knew I had done it before, I could do it again. Of course, on a Commodore 64, you cannot edit text files natively. So if all you have is a Commodore 64, a single disk drive, and 2 floppy disks like I had when I did this, you have to write your own editor as well as writing your own assembler. I wrote an editor in BASIC which used 256 byte strings over the span of an entire disk, and that's the only reason I needed 2 floppy disks. One disk held the editor and the assembler, and the other disk held the file being edited. And I don't remember how many lines I could have in my program, but it was not much. And that is the reason for some of the syntax of my assembler. What you typically see here is these left arrows. That left arrow effectively is a carriage return. You will see 2 lines of assembly on one line, or as many as it takes, I guess. There's no real limit to the number of lines I can have on a line, and that is the reason that this assembler works that way. There you can see probably 8 of them on a line. The original editor that I wrote was just could edit a file just barely large enough to write an assembly editor. In fact, the code for that editor, which I still have today, and I'll show that here when this is done, is very sloppy because of the size constraint. Now, when I had that editor in BASIC, I wrote the assembler at the same time, and then the first thing that I wrote in the editor was an assembly program to read the file from the disk, because the basic code to do that is excruciatingly slow. And then the next thing I did was write an editor. And writing that editor in assembly using the basic assembler took quite a bit of time. I wrote most of it on Sunday afternoons during Packer games. I would have the game on. The TV would be on with the volume mute, and I would have the radio on with the radio broadcast. Which I do that because the sportscasters on the Packer radio network are much better than the boneheads on the TV networks. But anyway, while watching and listening to the Packer games, I would have an SX64 propped up on a table in front of me, and I would be writing the editor. And eventually I got to the point where the editor was sufficient, and I didn't need the basic editor anymore. And then I could start working on the assembler. Now I started working on the assembler in November 2013, and I finished it, I think, 2 weeks ago here. I say finished in that it works and I no longer need the basic assembler, but it is by no means actually finished. There's a long way to go to make it a polished product. And of course I'm on my way to that, but it's going to be a while here. I think we're getting near to the point of being done here. I forgot what order these files are in. Otherwise I'd know exactly how much time is left here, I think. But as I was saying, I started writing the assembler, as you see it here, in November 2013, and finished it probably mid-April, or the end of April 2019. But the fact of the matter is, I didn't work on it all that time. In fact, when I finally got the impetus to start working on it again here a couple of weeks ago, probably 2 months ago, I hadn't worked on it at all since 2016. And I know I didn't work on it consistently from 2013 to 2016. If I had, there you can see the assembler assembled itself. Now, unfortunately, the code that it assembled here is not working because I'm in the process of rewriting the user interface. So I can't really demonstrate that it works. I'd have to pull up an older version to do that. But the point I was making here is that I could probably have done this in the span of a couple of months if I had spent as much time on it as I had recently. Now, had I been much younger, of course you can see here that the user interface is corrupt. Had I been much younger, like when I did this the first time, I probably could have done this in a month. Now, of course, that's partially because I have had the experience of doing it. The first time I did this did not go so quickly. And I think this is all you get. The assembler is effectively broken. But in a couple of days I should have that resolved. Yeah, well, something is missing, but I'll figure that out. It will be working again in a couple of days. And now I will attempt to demonstrate the editor. The editor is 10 blocks on the disk here, and of course with the fast loader it loads a little bit faster than normal. But everything goes slow when you have a 1541. The editor code is, I think, 47 blocks. It's considerably larger than it originally was when it worked just well enough to write the assembler. As I've gone along here, I've added things to make things easier. But it still looks very much like it did when I first wrote it. The code is very, very sloppy. And there's a lot of symbolic code that I did not use simply due to memory constraints at the time. Here you can see the last time I made a change to the editor was a couple of days ago, 5 days ago here. And no, I don't recall what I changed. I make minor changes here as I go along. Oh, I can tell you that I updated it here to work with the syntax of the assembler as it currently stands. The assembler that I have now, the assembly version of it, is no longer restricted to 6502 code. Here's another change that I obviously made. The basic assembler would not do that. And anyway, the point I was making here is that the instruction set for the processor is loaded from a file now. That's a improvement that I've made since writing the assembly version of the assembler. Now the reason for that is that the basic assembler obviously could only assemble code for the assembler for the processor that it was written for, which was a NMOS 6502 or 6510. And now I can easily write code for a 65C02 or a possibly even a 65816 if I wrote the interface for it. I imagine I could also do 6800 code in here. If not, I could easily modify the assembler so that it would work if it didn't. But here's the editor. A lot of the commenting I have added in recent years here did not exist when I first wrote it. There simply was not the space to do it. And of course I have cleaned up some of the code. I'll backtrack here. Like this, I obviously did not write the code this way. When I originally wrote the editor, it looked probably more like this, because I was simply constrained to the number of lines I could have in a file. In fact, it would probably be uglier than I'm even demonstrating here. Probably a lot of the code would be off the screen like that, just to get the number of lines down. And I should also point out here, here's an example of not using symbolic code. I did not have enough space to define all the symbols that I needed, so here I use an absolute address where I could have been using a symbolic reference. Of course, the editor that this code is the editor that you're seeing here. But this is the entire constraints of the file. Of course, a lot of things have been added, so it's larger than it was. But maybe you get the point of what I had to do here. So there's my explanation of what I've done. In a very haphazard way, I guess. Hopefully you found this video interesting and bothered to watch till the end. If not, I really don't blame you. I did not prepare for this at all, so it's kind of scatterbrained. But there you see my my results. Sort of. The assembler can assemble itself. I can probably do a better job of demonstrating that. Though this video has gone on long enough. I do have a disc here with a working version of the assembler. Although it's not called that on here. I think it's called that. Or not. So anyway, I'll end this video before I get too out of hand here. Thank you for watching. If you you have any questions or comments, please leave them below in the comments, of course. And if you're not a subscriber, please do subscribe. I do appreciate that. YouTube is not very friendly to those of us who have such few subscribers. And of course, thank you to all of those of you that are current subscribers. That does help. So there you have it. That's my my assembler project, and you probably won't see more videos of this. I may make one more video when I have the user interface. When I have the user interface completed. But other than that, I don't really see a point in making further videos about the assembler. So that's it. Thank you for watching.